Any diplomat will tell you, your friends' friends aren't necessarily your friends. We knew that at the start of the war in Ukraine when Israel made sure to keep up relations with both Ukraine and Russia. So it could keep on targeting Moscow ally Syria. Now, did that all change last Saturday night in Isfahan? Israeli drones reportedly targeting a defense facility in Iran's third largest city. What do we know about the raid and the target? Isfahan, a hub for Iran's nuclear program and also for the production of drones used in battle by the Russians in Ukraine. Already, Kyiv's ambassador to Tehran's been summoned over a celebratory tweet by a presidential advisor. More on that later. And then there's the timing, sandwiched between visits to Israel by the CIA director and the U.S. Secretary of State, hot on the heels of joint U.S.-Israeli war exercises. The U.S., which happens to be Ukraine's top backer against Vladimir Putin's invasion. Do events in the Middle East make Israel an ally of Ukraine against Russia? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking what next after that drone strike on Isfahan. And joining us from Herzliya, Israel, Eli Karmon, senior researcher at Reichman University's International Institute for Counterterrorism. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
From Washington, Barbara Slavin, lecturer at George Washington University. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Joining us from Birmingham, England, Scott Lucas, professor at UCD, University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Matthew Brodsky, senior fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy. How are you?
Great to be with you. I'm well.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. By the way, there's been another strike since Isfahan. A convoy of trucks hit Sunday night after crossing into eastern Syria from Iraq. Activists claim Iran-backed militiamen were the target. Same as with Isfahan, there's no claim of responsibility from Israel. This as questions still abound over the bomb-carrying drones that had hit Iran's third city. Lisa Kamenov has more.
This mobile phone video was aired on Iran's state TV, claiming to show a drone hitting an Iranian military factory in Isfahan on Saturday night. Iran's defense ministry claims to have intercepted 2 of the 3 drones that struck the military facility and caused minor damage to the building, with state TV showing images of what it says as drone debris.
The sound of explosion heard was from the air defense hitting the drone. People were initially stressed, but thanks to Allah, the news was published in time.
There was no claim of responsibility, but U.S. media, quoting unnamed U.S. officials, said Israel was behind the drone attack. The Israelis have been suspected of launching a series of attacks on Iran's nuclear program.
This cowardly act was carried out today as part of the efforts made by enemies of the Iranian nation in recent months to make the Islamic Republic insecure. Such measures cannot affect the will and intention of our specialists for peaceful nuclear developments.
The Isfahan region contains several nuclear research sites, including a uranium conversion plant. It is also home to a large airbase. The attack comes amid heightened tensions over Iran's nuclear program and its supply of weapons to Russia.
Let me begin with you, Eli Karmon. What happened in Isfahan? What do we know?
My name is Eli Karmon. That's okay. It's not clear what was exactly the target, because according to some information, this facility produced drones, advanced drones, but there is also talk about very advanced hypersonic missiles, and this would be much more important strategic weapons, not only now but also for the future, and not only for Ukraine. The fight in Iran itself is not because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. If it is a war, it is between the United States and its allies and Israel and Iran. And in spite of the declaration or the claiming of the Wall Street Journal that Israel was behind it, because they published in the past also some such claims. I must say that pro-Iranian militias attacked lately several American bases, including several days ago, the Al-Tanaf base in Syria. So the Americans have the same reasons, the same motivation, if necessary, to attack Iran, especially that we see in the last weeks an attempt to present a more aggressive face of the United States vis-à-vis Iran. For instance, with the very large military drill that was staged 2-3 days ago, and it was a message, I think, to the Iranian leadership.
So you have doubts over whether or not it might be Israel. One of the questions is one of geography. Isfahan is in the center of Iran. To reach it, it's not easy. There's reports suggesting that there may have been, those drones may have taken off from somewhere inside of Iran. Does that seem plausible?
Yes, it's possible. We see that during the last years, some of the operations that were considered to be made by the Mossad were either from the Iranian territory. The Iranians, by the way, accused in the past the Kurds in Iraq to give bases to the Mossad in order to strike Iranian targets, and several times they bombed, by the way, Erbil, the capital of the Kurdish province. And I think that it's already clear the last years that there is some very serious infrastructure that the Mossad has, not only in the countries like Azerbaijan or Kurdistan, but also inside Iran itself. By the way, several weeks ago, they presented several, they called terrorists, which were recruited by the Mossad, and they acted from Iran itself.
Yeah, Ronan Bergman, writing in newspaper Yediot Aharonot, says that in view of what a complex operation is and such a short amount of time, the attack on the base had to have been ready for execution long in advance and on Iranian soil, considering the short range of these drones. They're called quadcopters. Scott Lucas, let me ask you to rebound off of what you heard there from Eli Carmon. Does it sound plausible that it could be anybody else but Israel?
I think Israel is the most likely candidate for who carried out this attack for a number of reasons. First of all, if it's a pattern of Israeli attacks, this is not a recent development. Israel, over the past 2 years, has been attacking a series of Iranian military targets and indeed nuclear targets. They have attacked the uranium centrifuge facilities. They have attacked in Kermanshah. They've attacked the Parchin military base near Tehran. Secondly, it's because it's not just the Wall Street Journal that was told by, quote, people close to the operation, but also the New York Times, also Barak Ravid, who writes for Axios, that this was indeed an Israeli operation. They cite, at least Barak Ravid cites these unnamed officials saying that they did hit the facility in 4 different places. And I think significantly, to back up what Eli Carmon does say, that the target of this operation was missile production. It was not the drone production, the drones being provided to Russia for use in Ukraine. It was the missiles that Israel feels is a threat to itself directly. And that, again, fits the pattern of Israeli attacks in recent years.
And just another geography question then, Scott. The facility, if it was making hypersonic missiles, it could be doing so right in the center of town, not in some industrial park on the outskirts?
The nuclear facilities that your correspondent referred to are outside of Isfahan. They are not near the center, which indicates the target was not the nuclear program. But yes, these military facilities, very secretive military facilities near the center of Isfahan, it is known do have the capacity for drone and missile production.
All right, known to have the missile and drone production. The spillover from Saturday's Isfahan attack felt, you could say, in Kyiv. Ukraine's ambassador to Iran summoned after a celebratory tweet issued by an advisor to President Zelensky, Mikhailo Podolyak, commenting on social media. Explosive night in Iran, drone and missile production, oil refineries. Ukraine did warn you. I think the oil refineries was perhaps incorrect. There was an earthquake in another part of the country. But they didn't take kindly to it, Barbara Slavin, over in Tehran.
Yeah, well, the Iranians are trying to maintain the fiction that somehow they are neutral in this conflict, when, of course, we know that they have provided drones and other weaponry to the Russians. So I'm not surprised that the Ukrainians would do a little victory dance over this kind of strike. But it's, its impact, I think, has also to do with Israeli domestic politics. After all, it's not exactly been quiet in Israel and the West Bank lately. And by resuming these kinds of attacks, Bibi Netanyahu is once again using a tried and true tactic of pointing the finger at Iran as the threat rather than the deficiencies of Israel's own system of governance and lack of political freedom for a very large percentage of people who live on its territory and under its occupation. So there are multiple strands here that we can pull on.
But it's one thing, Barbara, to have the attack like the one that happened near the Iraqi border in Syria, which is a classic kind of attack that we have seen a lot of in the last couple of years, to the one that happened in Isfahan.
Yeah, but as Scott Lucas pointed out, it's hardly the first time that Israel has struck deep within Israel. I mean, Israel has killed a half a dozen Iranian nuclear scientists, including one who was killed with a remote-controlled machine gun, as I recall, not long before Joe Biden took office. Israel has sent operatives in to steal documents about Iran's nuclear program. This kind of penetration of Iran is not new, and it should be very worrisome to the Iranian government. I think it's one of the things that prevents Iran from actually building nuclear weapons, because the Iranian officials understand that Israel would know about this long before the last screw was screwed in. And so it acts in a way as a deterrence against even more alarming Iranian developments. At the same time, we have no nuclear talks. And Iran has enough fissile material already for as many as 4 nuclear weapons. So there, again, a lot of threads we can pull on here.
Yeah, we'll talk about the fact that the nuclear talks seem, for now, dead and buried. First, I want to ask you, Matthew Brodsky, how significant was this attack on Isfahan?
I think it's, I guess, average level of significance for what is most likely an Israeli attack. As everyone has pointed out, this is the kind of thing that we've seen before when Israel has wanted to. It has taken out nuclear scientists. It is, frankly, the only country that has really made clear as a red line that Iran will not be allowed to have nuclear weapons, and then acts to ensure that, while they've had a Trump policy that from their perspective, it was good that the U.S. got out of the nuclear deal because the deal was horrible to begin with and guaranteed a nuclear weapon, but that the economic sanctions alone weren't going to do enough, and having to deal with the Biden administration, which only wanted to resurrect the 2015 nuclear deal, but seems basically like a deer lost in headlights right now, without any type of policy, which is, again, why I would say it seems most likely that it was Israel that carried this out and not the United States, because the U.S. has really bent over backwards to maintain a open path for Iran to take a deal that is greatly in their benefit and, frankly,
but what do
not
you,
in America.
Matthew, what do you make of the timing then of this attack happening just as you've had the CIA director in Jerusalem and just before the arrival of the U.S. Secretary of State?
Right. So there are two sides to this coin, depending on how you want to look at it, right? On one hand, if this was about hypersonic missiles, that's one thing. If the attack was against drones for Israel, it's basically able to help Ukraine send a message to Russia, downgrade Iran without providing direct military assistance to Ukraine, which would annoy Russia enough that it could change Israel's room to maneuver inside of Syria, which of course Iran is entrenched in and Russia's there. When it comes to their attack on the facility, I think really this is just this isn't to do with the political calendar for Netanyahu. The Israelis know that he is capable and will attack Iran if it is threatened. And this has nothing to do with the West Bank and Palestinians either. This is really, I think, for them, they tend to, as you even indicated before, that it likely happened from within the country. They've had this capability for a while, but they wait until it reaches a critical point, and that's what they seem to have done.
The U.S. Secretary of State arriving then in Jerusalem this Monday, and same as during his previous stop in Egypt, Antony Blinken steering clear of commenting on what happened in Isfahan. However, happy to talk drones, especially when they connect the dots between Iran and Russia.
We discussed deepening cooperation to confront and counter Iran's destabilizing activities in the region and beyond. Just as Iran has long supported terrorists that attack Israelis and others, the regime is now providing drones that Russia is using to kill innocent Ukrainian civilians. In turn, Russia is providing sophisticated weaponry to Iran. It's a two-way street. Russia's ongoing atrocities only underscore the importance of providing support for all of Ukraine's needs, humanitarian, economic, and security, as it bravely defends its people and its very right to exist, a topic that we also discussed today.
Eli Carmon, I don't know if you had a fly-on-the-wall report back to you on the meeting between Antony Blinken and Benjamin Netanyahu, but would you bet that it was not the Palestinians, but Ukraine that was top of the list of conversation topics?
No, I'm sure the top of the list was Iran. And I would raise the attack on Isfahan in the American context. We have had the visit of Jack Sullivan, the head of the Security Council, several, I think, 10 days ago. The huge military drill in the Mediterranean against Iran as a message to Iran. The visit of Mr. Burns, the head of the CIA, which met with the head of the Mossad, and the visit of Mr. Blinken today. So I think that the main issue in these days was the coordination between Israel and the United States to be on the same line concerning the Iranian threat, especially the Iranian medium-range threat becoming nuclear. Because we must remember that 5-6 days ago, the head of the International Atomic Agency, Rafael Grossi, he declared that the Iranians have already enriched uranium to produce several atomic bombs. They have enriching uranium 60% in Fordow under underground facility, tripling the quantity of uranium. They have already 70 kilo of 60% uranium. So this is the big picture, the strategic picture. And by the way, I won't be surprised that this was a joint venture, if you want, Israeli-American venture, like it happened also during the Obama era or Bush era.
But so, Eli Carmon, you heard in that soundbite that we played, that clip, Antony Blinken saying, hey, Iran making drones for Russia, that's all the more reason.
Well, but this was, I would say, a political message to the Russians and to the Iranians.
But is it also a political message to the Israelis? That's what I'm asking.
To the Israelis, there was pressure during the last year that Israel provide Iron Dome anti-missiles to Ukraine. And this is a very sensitive issue, not only because of Russian presence in Syria, which, by the way, is thinned very much, and we continue to strike in Syria without progress, but because of, if you want, secret technologies, and also because it will not help Ukraine on the short time, to pass such kind of missiles to Ukraine. It means a lot of training, and it means to endanger, in a way, the secrets of the Israeli technology. So it was perhaps the attempt to ask Israel to provide other weapons, but clearly the issue of drones, because Israel, for instance, has provided the Ukrainians information about the technology of the drones, how to try to prevent them to reach the targets in Ukraine itself. So there is a lot of, in this spectrum of cooperation, there is a lot of things that Israel can provide. But again, according to my understanding, the main issue was to coordinate with the United States the strategic view, how to deal with Iran in the next year or maximum 2 years. This is a very critical period for the Israeli strategic interest, and Iran is the real threat on this very short period of time.
Barbara Slavin, when the U.S. Secretary of State goes to speak with the Israelis, is he looking at the nuclear threat first, or is he looking at the exporter, again, of those kamikaze drones that the Russians have been using against Ukraine?
Clearly,
Barbara Slavin.
Yes, I think Tony Blinken has a pretty broad portfolio when he goes to Israel. Ukraine is clearly top of mind in many ways, but as I mentioned, as Eli Carmon mentioned, Iran's nuclear program is completely unrestrained, and of course, that is the fault of the Trump administration, which withdrew from that nuclear deal in 2018. And Iran eventually began to ramp up its nuclear activities, ramped up its nuclear program. And we are in a very sensitive situation. I agree that the military maneuvers that were conducted by Central Command, with the inclusion of Israel, now a member of CENTCOM, were meant to send a message to Iran. And of course, the Iranian government is in a rather vulnerable state these days because of all the protests that have taken place since the killing of Mahsa Amini in police custody back in September. The Iranian economy is in very poor shape. The currency is at a record low against the US dollar and other hard currencies. So I think the calculation that was made by Israel was that this was a good time to do this kind of strike. I'm not sure the United States was part of it. The US usually declines to take any kind of responsibility, but I would imagine there was some sort of communication before the fact that this was going to take place. If it rattles the Russians in Ukraine, that's an extra benefit. But I also think there is a domestic element to this, and that is that Israel itself is experiencing an upsurge in violence, in communal violence, between Palestinians and Israelis. And whenever we're talking about Iran, we're not talking about how Palestinians are being treated or about the root causes of terrorism on both sides. So, in the Middle East, you get a lot of different strains, a lot of different motivations. And of course, Israel has shown itself very capable carrying out these kinds of attacks and changing the subject when it suits it.
Iran's got enemies and fights it's picked. Relations have soured even more between Iran and another former Soviet state. We're talking about its neighbor to the north, Azerbaijan, recalling all staff from its embassy in Tehran after a gunman last Friday killed the chief of security from its embassy in Tehran and wounded 2 others. The funeral of Orkan Askarov in Baku. You could say this moment marks a new low in relations with Iran, which claims that the assailant entered the embassy with 2 children and had a personal grievance, but security footage showed no evidence of children. The same Europeans, this showed no evidence of children. In fact, there is fury, the Azerbaijani Foreign Ministry releasing a statement calling it, quote, a treacherous terror attack and asserting that Iranian authorities had not taken action after being warned of threats to the embassy. Scott Lucas, this flare-up between Iran and Azerbaijan coming at this particular moment. Your thoughts on this?
It's not good for Iran. I mean, the context for what has happened is that during these protests that Barbara Slavin referred to, that started in mid-September, one of the key areas of that has been in West Azerbaijan and East Azerbaijan province in northwest Iran. bordering Azerbaijan, the Iranians have cracked down hard, have killed a lot of the protesters there, and at certain points they've tried to intimate that maybe Azerbaijan was allowing sanctuary for the protesters or even giving assistance. So relations were already strained even before this incident. But the wider context of this is that Iran has precious few friends left. It is not just simply the case of the US and Israel who have been cooperating. And the Biden administration has not given Iran a blank check. It's been working with Israel throughout its term in office. It is also the European powers who have turned increasingly against Iran, particularly because the Iranians effectively walked out of the nuclear talks last spring over a couple of issues: the Revolutionary Guards, inspections by the IAEA. China is now being very cautious regarding support of Iran, although it will take cheap Iranian oil. And Iran now is being forced to rely more and more on Russia. For example, the announcement in the past 24 hours of a deal between their central banks. The problem for the Iranians is what you have seen this weekend was both a military and a political message. It was a military message from the Israelis. If you are making missiles which are going to target us, we will hit you, we will contain you. And it's a political message. If you insist on putting all your chips on Russia, providing the drones for killing Ukrainian civilians, hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, you will pay a price for that as well. And I think the Iranians, who, as Barbara Sullivan mentioned, are in dire economic straits, have got a hard decision to make. Do they double down on this? Do they continue to ramp up their program, including their nuclear program, and risk further isolation? Or do they finally realize that their system may be at breaking point both within and internationally?
Is it a risk what Azerbaijan is doing? Because, again, now Iran and Russia are so closely tied. If you're taking on Tehran, are you also taking on Moscow?
No, because this is an axis of the vulnerable. A few years ago, if we talked about Russia or the Soviet Union and Iran, wow, this would have been, a process to rattle everyone. But the fact of the matter is that you have two countries who each are under a great deal of economic pressure. You have the Russians Vladimir Putin, who has gambled and failed to quickly conquer Ukraine and now finds his military very much overstretched. You find the Iranians, who have alienated a lot of their regional allies or would-be regional allies through some of their activities, including that of the Revolutionary Guards. And you find both countries. You find both countries with significant internal problems, whether it's the question of infrastructure in Russia or the question of infrastructure and public discontent in Iran. So no, the idea of the axis of resistance, as the Supreme Leader likes to call it, it's an axis of resistance whose clothes are looking very threadbare at this point.
All right, the panelists have mentioned it. The nuclear deal is dead in the water for now. There have been negotiations since September. The same Europeans who bemoaned Donald Trump's decision to walk away from the deal have now lost patience with Tehran. Across from the Eiffel Tower in Paris this past Saturday, a rally by families of 7 French citizens held on various charges. The French president himself has lashed out at Tehran for what he calls hostage diplomacy. There's some 24 foreign nationals currently held in Iranian jails. Since the attempts to revive the nuclear deal broke down, the regime has cracked down on Iran's biggest protest movement in decades. And when EU leaders meet for a summit in Brussels later this week, the Financial Times reports France and Germany may join the growing list of nations on this continent ready to follow the U.S. and put the Revolutionary Guards on a terror list. It's tricky, though, outlawing an army. France, according to that report, says it's interested in potentially designated certain regional divisions of the Guards as terrorist entities rather than the entire institution. How hard is it to I'll put it to you first, Matthew Brodsky, how hard is it to put a ban on the Revolutionary Guards? What purpose does that serve?
Well, the Revolutionary Guards are increasingly in control of Iran and is involved in the majority of Iran's economy. So you sanction them because they are essentially the terrorist hand of Iran that's in control. Beyond that, we see, which is unfortunate from an American perspective, is this consistent viewpoint from European nations that you can divide wings in a terrorist group, that you can say, we'll go after the Hezbollah, right? For example, an Iranian terrorist group, only after their terrorist wing, but not their political wing. We've seen the same thing with Hamas. When it comes to the IRGC, it's all a terrorist group. One side may work on politics and may work on fundraising, but it's all used for terrorist ideas. So it would be.
But hang on. Let me just ask a question here. What is? Let's define what the Revolutionary Guards are. Is it a paramilitary group like the Wagner Group in Russia, or is it an elite unit of the army?
It's a separate unit that's extra military. We went through the same discussion when people were saying after the assassination, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Al-Quds Force, that's part of the IRGC. It happens to be the expeditionary force, the terrorist force that works in other countries. And people in a lot of news networks trying to identify him as a normal military commander, as though he's from the normal Iranian military, which they have. That is incorrect. He was a terrorist leader from the terrorist arm of the terrorist regime. So we should be rather clear about that. I mean, of course, in authoritarian countries, you have various overlapping security agencies, but the IRGC has the most clout and military power in Iran, and it continues to grow. It would be damaging to the IRGC enough that you can start to have perhaps leaders in the IRGC realize that what their plan is going forward, the Iran regime plan going forward, is not good for them, because it really does put a hamper on their economic capabilities if they can't move money around or purchase things. So Europe should get on board this and do it with the entire IRGC, not start splitting hairs again in this imaginary belief that there's a political wing and a military wing. We know even today from this discussion, we're talking about what Israel did if it was Israel in this attack in Iran. And every one of us is agreeing that if it was a military target, then there was a military message, but there was also a political message. We know that they're hand in hand, same thing. It's an obvious extension of the logic.
Barbara Slavin, your thoughts on the more deliberate manner in which Europeans and even Britain has yet to put the Revolutionary Guards on a terror list. The fact that they're thinking long and hard before they do it.
I think it's smart for them to think long and hard, and I disagree a bit with Matthew on this issue. The IRGC is an organization of about 150,000, the majority of whom are conscripts. If you are a young man in Iran, you can be drafted into the IRGC. And I don't think those people are the people that we want to punish. It is the leadership of the IRGC and certain elements of the IRGC, the Quds Force, for example, that was mentioned, that have been involved in the activities that we find so objectionable. And so I don't think it's a mistake at all to try to distinguish between various elements and various leaders. Also, let's face it, these sanctions are increasingly symbolic. IRGC leaders do not have assets in the West that can be frozen. They do not travel to Paris. They do not go to Brussels or New York. So these are symbolic slaps. The nature of the sanctions that were reimposed by the Trump administration are such that, frankly, there's almost no commerce that takes place between any Iranian entity and any Western entity anymore, whether there's IRGC involvement or not. So I see this more as a political decision in support of the Iranian protesters, protesting Iran's support for Russia and Ukraine, which, of course, has really upset the Europeans. It's also a reflection of the fact that as was mentioned, Iran is holding numerous foreign nationals as hostages, including 3 Iranian Americans that it's refused to turn over, as well as its repression of its own citizens. So this is a political message if it comes. I also agree that Iran is becoming increasingly isolated, and that the government under Ibrahim Raisi has really become a kind of triple pariah. I've never seen Iran this isolated, not since the early days of the revolution. So it is time for the Iranian leadership to begin to reconsider, I think, some of the terrible choices it has made.
Elie Carmon, your thoughts on France and Germany considering putting the Revolutionary Guards on that terror list? Is it basically, as Barbara was stating, a political message?
Look, we spoke about the Al-Quds force. This is the main department, if you want, the main force that is staging terrorist attacks in coordination and straight cooperation with Hezbollah, including in Europe. There was a string of attacks in 2017, 2018. The Al-Quds force supported Hezbollah to build a huge ammonium nitrate arsenal in Europe, in UK, in Cyprus, in Germany, and even in France, although France is not recognizing this information leaked by the Americans, in Bolivia and in Thailand. Thousands and thousands of kilos of ammonium nitrate, which are ready to be used in terrorist attacks. And when in Cyprus there was a kind of trial for one of the operatives arrested, at the last moment the EU decided to put only the military department of Hezbollah on the list of terrorist organizations. So there is a lot of hypocrisy in this, and you cannot divide between the Al-Quds force and the IRGC. They are practically the same force. Here it is a very serious political issue, but I think the message to the government, to the regime, to the theocratic regime in Tehran, because also IRGC is the main force which is helping the regime to keep it alive in spite of the huge manifestations which are not still very active there. So I think the political message for Europe, including Germany and France, to the Tehran regime should be to consider IRGC as a terrorist organization.
Iran isolated, and it comes at a time when Israel has warming relations with many of its neighbors. Thus, and Barbara Slavin talked about it earlier, we're almost not spoken about the Palestinians. This weekend saw the bulldozing of the homes of militants who carried out a shooting spree in the wake of a deadly West Bank raid in the Jenin refugee camp. Tensions have been spiraling, and the election of Israel's most right-wing government ever contributing to the spiraling tensions. We've heard tough talk like that of Israel's prime minister.
We'll soon decide on measures to strengthen the settlement projects in Judea and Samaria to make clear to the terrorists that seek to uproot us from our land that we're here to stay.
Using language like Judea and Samaria, referring to what is the broader Israel plus the Palestinian territories. Scott Lucas, is Israel missing a chance to deepen ties in the region?
No, Israel's making a calculation, or I should be precise, the Netanyahu government is making a calculation that the Palestinians are pawns. And I think they're absolutely right, that they're pawns in the Middle East. As Barbara pointed out, and that Netanyahu clip makes clear, this is in the middle of a domestic project by the Netanyahu government, a hard right government swinging further to the right, which is effectively attacking the judicial system, in part because Benjamin Netanyahu faces a series of criminal charges. Now, to do that, you not only divert to Iran, but you take a hard line regarding the Palestine issue. But so do others. The Arab states use the Palestinians for pawns. They've done it for decades. They continue to do so. And using them as pawns, that gives Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, the latitude to develop relations with Israel on a very pragmatic basis, because all of them are looking at Iran as a potential foe and rival, and all of them are looking at economic benefit. And of course, the Iranians use the Palestinians as pawns. They use them as pawns as that they are part of this axis of resistance, that they will lead the fight against Zionism, etc., while realizing, in fact, that Iran has very little leverage in what it can do directly on the Israel-Palestinian issue, even if it has more leverage regarding an organization like Hezbollah.
Elie Carmon, let me ask you, because the Arab leadership is one thing. ordinary citizens are another, and in neighboring states, there's a lot of sympathy for Palestinians and their quest for a homeland. Is Israel missing an occasion by taking such a hard line?
I think that it's a very long story to speak about this issue at the end of this show. But very shortly, the Palestinians will not disappear. They are not pawns. In the end, Israel cannot survive as a state, a democratic state, without some agreement with the Palestinians. There is a problem with the Palestinian leadership, with Abu Mazen, which is for 40 years without being elected, very old man, without people which will inherit it, him and so on. But from the Israeli point of view, I think there is today a very big tension between the government, the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu, and the opposition, which tried to advance some kind of talks, especially General Benny Gantz, with the Palestinian Authority. And this is a real threat to the Abraham Accords. We had the same situation in 2000, after the Oslo agreements. We had the diplomatic relationship with Qatar, with Morocco and Mauritania. The moment the violence of the Second Intifada erupted, all these countries cut their relationship with Israel. And I think the same will happen these days if the escalation of violence between Israel and the Palestinians will really become a third Intifada. Look, the Emirates are part of the, by the way, together with France, of those which asked the Security Council to discuss twice the situation in the West Bank. The Saudis clearly don't want to advance the normalization in this situation. And even the visit that Prime Minister Netanyahu had to do to the Emirates in the first week of his victory didn't materialize. So if the violence will increase and the extremist elements in the Israeli government will produce this kind of provocations, in the end we'll have really a situation which will get out of control from the point of view of Israel and its strategic interest in the region.
Yeah, and it's again, I'll put it to you, Eli Carmon, because there's a lot of fears over the fact that this year Ramadan taking place, you've got Passover, Easter, and Ramadan all happening at the same time. Is there really that fear of a third Intifada?
The Intifada has begun. It's a bit difficult to consider it similar to what happened in 2000, 2005, but it is a beginning of a kind of different Intifada, but a very serious situation. Now, Ramadan has always been a trigger for more violence, and Hamas for the last years, especially the last 2 years, has taken the narrative of defense of the Al-Aqsa and the mosque and the Temple Mount as the defender of these interests of the Palestinian and Muslim nation. And therefore, they will do everything possible, either through staging attacks through proxies in the West Bank or even from Gaza Strip, perhaps even to fire missiles to Israel. My opinion is that as long as Hamas continues to control the Gaza Strip, there is no way of any agreement, any serious process with the Palestinian Authority. And in this, I think the international community, especially the Arab countries, especially Egypt, Jordan, and the Europeans and the Americans should do much more trying to change the done in the Gaza Strip.
All right. So when it comes at the end of the day, when you're sitting where you are, it is about what's happening in the neighborhood, less so about what's happening further afield. Eli Carmon, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Herzliya in Israel. I want to thank Barbara Slavin in Washington, Scott Lucas in Birmingham, and Matthew Brodsky in Minneapolis. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.